Now back to the show. This is The Law Show on CL 650.
Sorting out Canada's immigration laws. Good luck with trying to pull that off in an hour, but we're certainly doing our level best this morning with the very capable assistance of Gordon Maynard and Rudy Kisher from the Vancouver immigration law firm Maynard Kisher Stojkovic downtown. Gentlemen, we've spent most of the program talking about the express entry program as it pertains to certain skilled classes of workers seeking permission to come here to work and to immigrate. But we just barely started to talk about unskilled workers. And now, during the break, Rudy, you talked about student people who come to Vancouver and across Canada. We allow, close to 60,000 students every year to come to Canada that they don't have to observe any of these very rigid protocols you've spent so much time describing.
Yeah, they come under what's called a youth mobility program usually. So they're younger than 35 or maybe cut off at 30 from various countries that Canada has agreements with. Mm-hmm. These programs were supposed to be reciprocal, and the idea being that Canadians would go abroad and work abroad, and we would do almost a direct exchange in the number of students that would come to Canada or young people and the number of young people from Canada that would go abroad and work. But what's happened is Canada's economy has done fairly well over the last 5 years.
Sure.
And what you've seen is large numbers of Irish, large numbers of Australians, of New Zealanders coming to Canada and taking sometimes unskilled work. And there's a recent report out saying that it has affected the ability of Canada's youth to actually find jobs by having 60,000 people show up in Canada, mm-hmm. some of them with very limited skills, looking for these low-skilled jobs when our own recent graduates are having problems finding jobs. So it's definitely created, some would say, a negative effect on the labor market.
And I suppose, Gordon, when we're talking about unskilled workers, regardless of whether they're here on a student entry program or they've come over here specifically to work at a job, I would think that group of people would be the most likely to be, well, jerked around, for lack of a better, more legal phrase, by their employers and ultimately by the government because of the vulnerability that they represent.
Yeah, particularly I think those that are on the employer-specific work permits.
Right, exactly.
In some cases, some of those workers, not many of them, some of them will have an opportunity to move on to permanent residence if they have a supporting employer. Mm-hmm. And that's where you get this relationship where you need me more than I need you.
Exactly. And thus opening the door to possible abusive situations.
Absolutely.
Okay. So temporary workers, temporary, the phrase is fairly self-explanatory, Rudy. You're expected to come to Canada, work for a while, and say goodbye. And why is it then that so many temporary workers see that as their ticket to permanent residency in Canada?
Well, I think an economist that Gordon and I both know, Dan DeWorts, he said one time, he says, there's nothing more permanent than a temporary foreign worker. So, if you look at people, depending where they're coming from, I think under those youth mobility agreements, some of those people are really coming for an experience, couple ski seasons at Whistler, and, sure. they're going to go home.
Right.
But if you look at people coming, especially under the low-skilled program, they're coming from countries where life is really hard. They're coming from the Philippines, where the money they make here makes a big difference in the standard of living back home. Mm-hmm. And they also build their hopes and dreams on coming to Canada. And, Canada is seen as a land of immigration. And unfortunately, some of them don't get the straight goods in terms of how hard it is really going to be to qualify for immigration. And some of them believe, that their employer is going to treat them fairly. And when the employer says, well, if you come here and work for a year and you work out, we're going to help you immigrate. And I've seen, I do some pro bono work with access to justice, and I see people coming in there, a lot of them in the hospitality industry, that unfortunately have been misled by their employer.
Sure.
They show up, they're working for a year, they approach the employer, and the employer says, well, maybe not this year, come back in 6 months, in another year. And then, time drags on and their work permits, is going to expire soon, and there is no avenue left for an immigration. And then the employer's like, sorry, it didn't work out, you'll have to go home. And meanwhile, they've sacrificed more than 4 years of their life, hoping to build a life here, and they're supposed to leave after that.
Gordon, we're seeing a bit of a downturn in the economy, particularly next door in Alberta, where they use a lot of unskilled foreign workers, and not just up in Fort McMoney either, all over the province. Mm-hmm. So what happens if you've been imported into Calgary? to work in an unskilled situation in a restaurant. And the economy's it's heading south, and the restaurant doesn't need you anymore.
Well,
and you're contracted to be here for 2 years. You've been here 6 months, and your job's gone. Then what happens?
Well, you're in trouble. If you came here under an open work permit as a student, then you simply leave and try and find another job. That's the meaning of an open work permit. It's not employer specific.
Okay.
But if you came here under an LMIA work permit, it is employer specific. It says you can work for so-and-so and you can do this job.
Right.
And it's for a limited
for this
period
amount of time.
Exactly.
Right.
And so if they tell you that you're no longer with a job there, you have to get another LMIA in order to support another work permit. And you can't work until you do.
You got to find an employer who has that LMIA or is willing to go through take the expense and the time to get an LMIA to be able to hire you. And the problem with the people in this category usually have the least financial
I was just going to say they have no money, and now they don't even have a job.
They're living paycheck to paycheck.
Yep. And it takes time. And not only that, but for the changes in the LMIA program, for low-skill jobs, you're not allowed to get them in a number of occupations unless the employment rate is at a certain level or unemployment rate is at a certain level.
Okay.
And for certain employers, that they're setting an aim now that you can only have a certain percentage of foreign workers. So there are some companies that have maybe 50 or 90% foreign workers, and they're being told you're not going to get a new LMIA because we're trying to reduce your reliance on foreign workers so that next year there'll be a 10% reduction in your workforce in foreign workers. So basically the employer's being told you got to fire those people.
Wow.
Because you can't keep them. We're not going to give you an LMI for them. So now they're stuck here in Canada, and they have to decide, well, do I go home? Do I stay here? How do I stay here?
Right. And perhaps don't even have the money to go home, even if that's where I want to go.
Yeah.
Just, all of a sudden stranded high and dry, no work, no money, no income, no nothing.
Yeah.
So, gentlemen, we're almost out of time, and we've just barely scratched the surface in terms of addressing or even recognizing all of these changes that have come down in the past couple of weeks with Immigration Canada and the Express Entry Program and others. As we go forward, I look forward to more conversations about this, but where does the average Canadian go on the internet to even have a look at trying to understand what's going on and get a handle on it? I find government websites atrocious in terms of being able to follow. They're not very helpful. Are there any others, Rudy, that you could recommend?
Well, I think, it's fine to go look at the government website and try and get an understanding and educate yourself, but we generally recommend that it's worthwhile calling a professional, a lawyer preferably, and spending some time to look over what your options are, because people can lose valuable time.
Right.
They can make mistakes, which is becoming more prevalent in terms of misrepresenting what's been put in there because they don't understand the question and can end them up in a lot of trouble. So we recommend that they find a professional that can can sort of go over this whole total web that has now been created by immigration, so they understand which way to go.
Right. And by the way, the particulars for our guests, Gordon Maynard and Rudy Kisher, are on their website, which is vancouverlaw.ca. That's the official website of Maynard, Kisher, Stojkovic, and all of the contact points, emails, and lots of information about the firm also available to you. The website again, vancouverlaw.ca. Gordon and Rudy, wow, terrific hour. Look forward to more because there's a lot more to unravel.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you next time on The Law Show.